Hey guys, tonight we slip into the sands of time literally. The desert stretches endlessly around you, quiet and pale under a waxing moon, each grain of sand whispering secrets from thousands of years ago. There's no Wi-Fi, no streetlights, and definitely no modern plumbing, but there are mummies, not the Hollywood kind with dramatic entrances and perfect linen wrapping, the real ones, messy, tragic, sacred, and occasionally still a little gooey. You've probably seen them behind glass at museums dried, silent, slightly judgmental. But tonight, you're going to walk with them. No, not metaphorically. You're going to trace the path their bodies took from fresh death to final entombment, with every ancient squish and crunch in between. This isn't just a history lesson, it's more like an olfactory roller coaster meets a spiritual scavenger hunt. And fair warning if you're squeamish, easily spooked, or allergic to resin fumes, you might not survive this trip. But don't worry, most ancient Egyptians didn't either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing where my sleepy historians are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the edge of the Nile. The sun is just dipping below the horizon, bleeding orange and gold into the rippling waters. Around you, the world is preparing for nightfall, but not everyone is going to sleep. In a modest brick house just outside the city of Memphis, a man has died. He was a mid-level scribe, not noble, not poor someone who translated tax records and got headaches from too much papyrus dust. His family is already scrambling. Time is ticking. In ancient Egypt, the body starts decomposing within minutes in this sweltering heat. It's not poetic. It's bloating, leaking, bubbling, so the moment someone dies, the clock begins for the journey of preservation. You're standing in the room as his widow weeps softly. The priest arrives, fingers dyed brown from myrrh and resin, and with a voice smoother than linen, begins the rites. The process must begin immediately. There's no weekend off in the afterlife industry. But here's the kicker, not everyone in ancient Egypt wanted to be mummified. Some couldn't afford it, some feared the process, and some, well, didn't get a choice. You follow the priest and his helpers as they lift the body onto a small cart. A linen sheet covers the man's face, but the corners of his mouth are still visible, pulled slightly open, as if he was mid-sentence when death arrived. They roll him down narrow streets toward the embalming area near the edge of town, a place locals tend to avoid unless absolutely necessary. The smell gets worse as you approach a heady mix of natron salt, rot, incense, and goat droppings. You're definitely not hungry anymore. The site is half open air, half shaded by palm fronds, buzzing with flies and soft murmurs. Embalmers in linen kilts move with practiced ease, joking quietly in between tasks. It's a business. After all, behind the holy rituals and prayers is an industry, and business is booming. The man is laid on a sloped table of polished stone. The tools are already prepared. You spot a long, hooked blade, bronze glinting in the twilight. One worker dips his hands in resin and mutters a prayer to Anubis, the god of death, who, ironically, was one of the more hygienic deities in the Egyptian pantheon. The priest makes a small incision on the left side of the abdomen, and then, without hesitation, the real work begins. First, the intestines. You watch maybe from behind your fingers as they reach in and begin removing the man's internal organs, one by one. The liver, the lungs, the stomach, all placed in small jars with divine faces carved into the lids called canopic jars, in case you're collecting vocabulary. But then comes the brain. Here's where things get spicy. Ancient Egyptians believed the brain was just stuffing. The heart was the seat of the soul and intellect. So, Naturally, the brain had to go, using a thin metal rod. The embalmers enter through the nostril and, well, stir. A lot. It's like watching someone whisk pancake batter in reverse. Then, they tip the head and let gravity do its thing. The brain oozes out. Sometimes, the rod slips and hits bone. Sometimes, it doesn't come out at all. Sometimes, it smells really bad. You take a step back. One of the helpers gags. This is not a job for the poetic. It's a job for those with strong stomachs and better pay than farming. Now, the body is rinsed with wine and stuffed with natron and ancient salt that dries out the flesh. It's inserted into every crevice, every single one. You really don't want to know where else that natron goes. It's like packing a corpse into a giant bag of baking soda and waiting for it to crisp up. Over the next 40 days, the man will dry. His family will bring offerings, bribes, even food though. Oddly, not for him to eat, and just in case the gods are watching. But sometimes, the family never comes back. You overhear the embalmers murmuring about another body, one from 2 weeks ago, still lying in the back tent, half embalmed and completely forgotten. No money, no prayers, no one to care. And if no one comes, they cut corners, skip steps, reuse jars. Sometimes they even sell the body back to another client. Yes, the afterlife had a black market, very chic. Historians still debate whether the poor were ever truly mummified, with care, or simply tossed into mass graves, hurried and nameless. A cat slinks by, tail flicking. In ancient Egypt, cats were sacred. You wonder if it's watching to protect the dead, or just looking for a mouse. The man's body is stiff now, darkened and shrunken. His lips have pulled back, exposing teeth in what looks almost like a smile. The embalmers begin the wrapping process, layer upon layer of linen, each with a prayer, each finger wrapped individually, amulets inserted at key points, a scarab over the heart, an eye of Horus over the throat. You catch a glimpse of something shiny between folds of cloth, a tiny gold beetle, maybe worth more than the man ever earned alive. And finally, the face, a mask, painted in serene, with almond eyes and a calm smile, is placed over the mummified features. Now, he looks noble, peaceful, eternal. You've walked this entire path, from deathbed to desert burial chamber. You're tired, but something inside you feels full. Maybe it's understanding, maybe it's awe, or maybe it's just the weight of 3,000 years pressing gently on your chest. The stars are out now. The Nile glows silver. You close your eyes just for a moment. You stumble into the next chapter of this ancient tale, where death's grip loosens and the lines between life and afterlife blur in ways that would make any modern-day witness squirm. Because here's the thing, not all mummies were exactly dead when the process began. Sometimes, it was a bit messier. Imagine being on the sidelines watching someone take the first steps into the long, slow march of death, while priests are already prepping to turn them into a walking corpse. Spoiler alert, it did not go well for the living or the witnesses. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't always a clean cut. The ancient medical knowledge was impressive for its time, but when someone hovered between life and death, priests faced a tricky dilemma. Mummification was meant for the dead. But what if the dead weren't fully gone? You're standing in the embalming tent, eyes wide as a man gasps, chest rising and falling faintly beneath the linen wraps. His heartbeat might be barely there, or his breath shallow and slow. But the priests sworn to prepare him for eternity have already begun. This was not a practice for the faint-hearted. Take, for example, the infamous story of the half-dead man. You may have heard whispers about it in dusty history books or the occasional documentary, narrated with an eerie voice. Some scholars speculate that this was less myth and more real nightmare. The man was likely suffering from a coma or severe illness that made him appear lifeless. His family, desperate and unwilling to wait, called the embalmers too early. So, What happens when someone comes back after being embalmed? You might think that ancient Egyptians had some magical resurrection plan, but the truth was more gruesome than miraculous. As the embalming began, the man's fingers twitched. The priest paused. No. Wait, the fingers moved again. Helpers stumbled back, startled, some shouting prayers, others frozen with fear. The man's eyes fluttered, not with life but with the spasms of a body betrayed by its own nerves. Witnesses say there was a mix of horror and fascination. The line between walking dead and truly dead blurred into an unsettling spectacle. Priests doubled down, wrapping the linen tighter, applying more resin to seal the body. There was no turning back. For the man, it was a slow slide into unconsciousness or something worse, a half-existence trapped in layers of drying cloth and resin. And the smells. Oh, the smells. You might think embalming would mask the odour of decay. But early attempts were more like layering stink upon stink. Natron dried the flesh, but the process released a nauseating cocktail of gases. Sulphur, ammonia, and the unmistakable stench of rotting brain matter. Witnesses who weren't faint of heart described the embalming tent as a stench chamber, with some passing out mid-ritual, and that was on a good day. One embalmer's journal. Okay, maybe it was just a papyrus note, scrawled hurriedly, reportedly described a scene where an embalmer vomited into the Nile after a botched brain extraction. You picture this scene in your mind. The poor guy leaning over the riverbank, the Nile flowing obliviously beneath the sun's fierce glare. This gruesome dance wasn't just a sensory assault, it was a psychological one. 2 witnesses, family members, servants, even curious neighbours were sometimes left traumatised. You might think their faith kept them steady, but it's likely they prayed harder and hoped to be anywhere but here. But here's a historical fun fact you can chew. On some evidence suggests the embalming process may have been rushed or performed under tight deadlines due to religious calendars. The annual opening of the mouth ceremony, vital for the deceased's journey to the afterlife, had to happen on specific dates. Miss it, and you risk eternal wandering without a face or voice. This explains why some embalmers took shortcuts, or why certain bodies were wrapped poorly or inconsistently. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a rush order with disastrous results. And then there's the medical debate. Historians and forensic experts still argue whether embalming techniques evolved from a trial and error, or if they had highly specialised knowledge about human anatomy. Some propose that the practice's origins were as much spiritual as scientific, blending religion with proto-medicine. Whatever the truth, the living dead scenario haunted Egyptian embalmers and witnesses alike. Stories circulated about bodies twitching under bandages, groaning as if trapped between worlds, or even sitting up in tombs, though that last one probably owes more to horror stories than fact. The fact is, witnessing a half-dead mummy walk, or at least move, was terrifying and, frankly, a terrible sales pitch for the embalming business. Families sometimes refused to hand over bodies, waiting for clear signs of death. But nature isn't polite, and sometimes embalming began too soon. As you imagine this scene, the sounds of gasping breaths, the slapping of linen wraps, the groans muffled under resin, you realise this wasn't a quiet, peaceful farewell. It was a messy, smelly, and sometimes downright horrifying ordeal. And yes, modern forensic science has confirmed several ancient Egyptian mummies show evidence of embalming performed on people who might not have been fully dead, or at least on bodies that retained residual movements during early mummification. So next time you see a mummy in a museum, picture the poor soul beneath those layers not quite gone, caught between life and death, a walking reminder that even the ancients had their own version of medical malpractice. And speaking of malpractice, here's a little-known detail: some embalmers actually developed resin glue so sticky that it trapped twitching fingers and toes, effectively forcing the body to stay still. This resin was a mix of tree sap, beeswax, and sometimes animal fat, a gruesome early invention of medical restraint. Historians still debate whether this technique was common practice or an experimental fix for difficult cases. So, The next time you imagine a mummy walking, remember it might be less about curses and more about desperate embalmers wrestling with the awkwardness of premature burial and bodies that refuse to stay put. And honestly, if you just fainted through the whole ordeal, you'd probably call it a night too. You find yourself stepping into the heart of the embalming chamber, a place unlike any spa or hospital you've ever seen. This isn't a tranquil sanctuary scented with lavender and eucalyptus. No, it's a chaotic symphony of sights, sounds and smells that assault your senses from every angle. Imagine standing amidst wooden tables slick with resin, bundles of linen stacked like eerie towers, and the unmistakable pungency of decay mixing with incense thick enough to cloud your vision. This is where the magic or the madness happens. The first thing you notice is the sheer volume of materials scattered around. There are jars filled with strange oils, pots of natron salt piled high like snowy dunes, bundles of papyrus scrolls inscribed with spells and prayers, and tangled coils of linen waiting to embrace their soon-to-be owners. The embalmers move with practiced hands, but behind their steady movements lies an undercurrent of grim determination. The stakes are high: preserve the body perfectly, or risk the soul's eternal unrest. Now, the embalming room wasn't a place for the faint-hearted or the weak-nosed. Witnesses to the process often fled or fainted because the smells were something else entirely. Natron, a naturally occurring salt used to dry the body, worked wonders but smelled like a cross between rotten eggs and old sweat. Combine that with the stench of decomposing organs and resin burning on hot stones, and you've got a sensory overload that would make even the hardiest ancient Egyptian gag, one witness wrote. The air is thick and suffocating, filled with a scent that clings to your throat like a wet blanket. You too can almost taste the bitter tang, feel the thick smoke clogging your nostrils, and hear the faint buzz of flies gathering around the fleshy remains. Here's a fascinating detail not many know: the embalmers used a special concoction of spices and herbs to mask the worst odours. Frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and sometimes even cinnamon-infused honey were burned or smeared onto the corpse. These scents weren't just about making things smell better. They were believed to help repel evil spirits and prepare the deceased for their journey. Unfortunately, their efforts were only partly successful, and many witnesses still left the room holding their noses. You watch as one embalmer carefully removes the man's stomach. It's a delicate process, involving small hooks and knives made of copper and bronze. The removed organ is then treated separately, washed, salted, and placed into a canopic jar carved with the likeness of one of the 4 sons of Horus, guardians of the organs. Each jar had a specific purpose. The jackal-headed Duamutef protected the stomach, the falcon-headed Kebesenuef, the intestines, the human-headed Imseti, the liver, and the baboon-headed Hapi, the lungs. While this might sound like a well-organised routine, things didn't always go smoothly. There are recorded cases of jars being mislabeled or organs lost entirely. Imagine the horror of realising that your beloved father's heart is missing, or worse, placed in the wrong jar. The heart, in particular, was sacred. It was weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the afterlife to determine worthiness. And speaking of the heart, here comes an interesting twist in some rare cases. Embalmers deliberately left the heart in the body, while in others, they removed it to protect it from corruption. Scholars still debate whether this inconsistency was due to evolving beliefs or practical challenges during embalming. You glance around and spot an embalmer carefully placing resin-soaked linen strips around the man's torso. This sticky, amber-coloured substance was critical not just to seal the body but also to bind the layers of linen together. It worked like an ancient superglue, ensuring the wrappings didn't unravel over centuries. In fact, resin was so important that it became a precious commodity. Some embalmers tried to cheat by diluting it with cheaper substances, but such shortcuts were often detected and harshly punished. The integrity of the mummification process depended on these materials, and fraud wasn't taken lightly. Now, The wrapping itself was an art form. It was more than just tossing linen over a body, it was a precise, prayer-laden ritual. Each finger was wrapped individually, then the limbs, then the torso, with amulets inserted between layers for protection. The process could take days or weeks, and mistakes were embarrassing and costly. You notice that the embalmers chant softly as they work, invoking gods like Osiris and Anubis, beseeching them to accept the deceased into their eternal kingdom. The chants have a hypnotic rhythm, blending with the crackle of resin fires and the shuffle of linen. But even with all this care, mistakes were common. There's an infamous story of a nobleman whose left arm was wrapped to the right side of his body. Another time, an embalmer accidentally wrapped a mummy so tightly that its legs were permanently bent, causing an awkward, almost comical pose. You chuckle softly. Ancient embalming wasn't perfect, and these little oops moments remind you that even 3,000 years ago, people were human. And here's a fun debate that scholars love to argue over: were the embalmer's mistakes a sign of rushed work, or deliberate attempts to confuse grave robbers and protect the body? Some say misaligned wrappings and extra amulets were a form of spiritual decoy, making it harder for thieves to find valuables hidden within. As the final layers of linen settle over the body, you catch your reflection in a polished bronze mirror nearby. The dim light flickers, and for a brief moment, you swear the mummy's eyes blink. You shake your head, reminding yourself to stop watching too many horror movies. Suddenly, a guard steps in, signalling that it's time to move the body to the burial chamber. You follow the procession out, the heavy scent of resin trailing behind like an invisible cloak. Outside, the desert wind is cool and clean, an abrupt contrast to the embalming room's chaos. The man you followed will soon rest within stone walls, beneath hieroglyphs promising safe passage and eternal life. As you walk away, you hear a faint whisper on the wind, a reminder that, while the body sleeps, the stories of those long gone continue to wander, waiting for you to remember. You step away from the embalming chamber and into the bustling marketplace of death, the business behind the sacred rituals. Mummification wasn't just a religious duty. It was a thriving industry with all the complexities, negotiations, and yes, scams you might expect from any thriving market. If you thought ancient Egypt was all solemn gods and golden tombs, think again. Behind every mummy lay a web of contracts, bribes, and profit margins. Imagine being the middle-class family of the man you followed. Your loved one is dead. But now you face the challenge of securing a proper mummification within your budget. There are tiered services, just like today's subscription plans. The rich splurge on ornate coffins, exquisite masks, and elaborate rituals performed by the most skilled priests. The poor well. Sometimes the embalming process was abbreviated or skipped entirely, and the body buried quickly to avoid stench and social shame. You watch a family haggling over prices with the scribe, the air thick with tension. They want to ensure their relative's soul reaches the afterlife without any embarrassing shortcuts. But prices can skyrocket with each added prayer, amulet, or linen wrap. And time is money if embalming takes too long. The body risks decomposing, and so do the family's hopes. The embalming priests and their assistants had reputations to protect. Some were famed for their skill, while others were whispered about in taverns as body flippers, embalmers who rushed through the process or skimped on materials to line their pockets. You overhear a patron grumbling about receiving a shoddy wrapping job, with linen threads unravelling before the funeral even began. A scandal, even by ancient standards. But here's a surprising twist. Embalming was sometimes seen as a status symbol, almost like a luxury brand. Some families saved for years just to afford the gold standard of mummification, including elaborate amulet collections and exquisite coffin art. Being well mummified signified not only wealth, but also piety, and a sure ticket to eternal life. Meanwhile, less fortunate souls faced grim alternatives. Some were wrapped quickly in coarse linen, their organs left inside the body, or not dried properly. Others were dumped into communal graves, nameless and forgotten. It's estimated that only about 10% of ancient Egyptians could afford full mummification. The rest had to settle for simpler burials. You watch as a vendor sells canopic jars not made by official artisans, but by cheaper copycats. They're painted roughly, the faces of Horus's sons uneven and distorted. A local complains that such jars won't protect the organs properly and might anger the gods. These counterfeit jars are a hot topic among archaeologists and historians, sparking debates about authenticity and belief in the afterlife. And here's a juicy academic debate. For you, some scholars argue whether these cheaper mummies were even real mummies at all. Were they just bodies preserved by accident? Or was there a distinct cultural divide between true and false mummification? The answer remains murky, buried beneath layers of sand and scholarship. A merchant nearby proudly shows off a set of funerary amulets, some fashioned from rare stones imported from Nubia and Lebanon. These treasures were believed to guard the deceased from evil spirits and ensure safe passage through the perilous underworld. Families often bought multiple amulet scarabs, eyes of Horus, jed pillars not just as protection, but as a display of devotion and social standing. But it's not all solemn business. The embalming trade also had its share of grifters and hustlers. Some embalmers were little more than charlatans who offered cheap and dangerous services, sometimes botching the process and turning the dead into horrifying messes that no one wanted to claim. Gossip spreads fast, even in ancient times. You overhear a story about a notorious embalmer caught selling the same resin multiple times or using sand instead of natron to cut costs. His customers were understandably horrified when their loved ones began to decay faster than expected. His trial was a spectacle, with families demanding justice for spiritual malpractice. And then there's the strange phenomenon of funerary insurance. Wealthy Egyptians sometimes entered contracts guaranteeing their mummification and burial rites would be fulfilled even after their death. If the priest failed, the family could claim compensation or demand the ritual be redone. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern insurance agent. All of this paints a vivid picture. Mummification was as much a social and economic event as a spiritual one. It wasn't just about preparing a body, it was about negotiating status, faith, and legacy. As you walk away from the market, the smells of spices and resin linger in your nostrils, mixing with the dry desert air. You realize that even in death, ancient Egyptians were deeply human, dealing with money worries, family drama, and sometimes just a little bit of bad luck. And speaking of luck, remember that unlucky scribe we met earlier? His family is still scrambling to afford the best mummification package possible, because in the end, even in the afterlife, reputation matters. You find yourself entering the shadowy world of ancient Egyptian tombs, stone chambers filled with secrets, traps, and a sense of eerie timelessness. The tomb was supposed to be a sanctuary, a final resting place designed to protect the body and spirit from harm for eternity. But as you step inside, you quickly realize that not everything about these eternal homes was so eternal or safe. The walls are covered with intricate hieroglyphic stories and spells designed to guide the deceased through the afterlife's many challenges. These texts weren't mere decoration. They were believed to have real power, helping the soul avoid dangers and reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. You trace your fingers lightly over the carvings and feel a strange connection to those ancient beliefs. But tombs were also tempting targets. Looters, grave robbers, and treasure hunters were an ongoing plague. Despite all the curses and warnings inscribed on the walls, death will befall anyone who disturbs this tomb. Many could not resist the promise of gold, jewels, and sacred artifacts buried alongside the dead. You hear whispered tales of tombs so well hidden that no one found them for centuries. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the 20th century was like unearthing a time capsule, perfectly preserved with treasures and mummies intact. Yet, Even his tomb was not immune to the rumours of curses and mysterious deaths, more legend than fact, but captivating nonetheless. Here's a detail you might not expect. Some tombs had false chambers and decoy coffins to fool robbers. These elaborate traps were part spiritual protection, part psychological warfare. Some walls were painted with scenes of fierce guardians, while others concealed deadly pits or collapsing ceilings. You move deeper into the chamber and spot the sarcophagus, the stone coffin carved with the likeness of the deceased. It's heavy, imposing, and covered in gold leaf and precious stones. Inside lies the mummy, carefully wrapped and preserved, awaiting the final journey to the afterlife. But not all tombs were this grand. Many Egyptians, especially commoners, had simple pits or mud brick tombs, barely protecting their bodies from the elements, let alone from thieves. You wonder how many souls were lost because of this disparity. Scholars still debate how much the afterlife beliefs influenced tomb design. Was it all about protection, or was the tomb itself a symbol of status, a way to immortalize oneself on earth? The answer might be a little of both. As you explore, you find remnants of funerary goods, jars of food and drink, figurines called shabtis meant to do labour in the afterlife, and personal belongings. These items tell stories of hopes, fears, and the daily lives of people long gone. But you can't help but think for all the care taken in death. The reality was often harsh. Many tombs were robbed within years, and bodies damaged or destroyed. It's a stark reminder that even in death, security was never guaranteed. And finally, as you prepare to leave the sacred space, you notice a faint breeze. You shiver not from cold, but from the weight of the thousands of years of history pressing gently against your skin. The mummy in the sarcophagus rests quietly, but their story, your story, continues. You drift from the quiet solemnity of the tomb chambers into the lively world of rituals and ceremonies at ancient Egypt's theatrical finale for the dead. Mummification was only the first act. The real show began with the funeral rites designed to ensure the deceased's safe passage and acceptance into the afterlife. These rituals were elaborate, emotional, and sometimes downright strange by today's standards. You stand among a crowd gathered at the edge of a necropolis, a mix of mourners, priests, and curious onlookers. The air is heavy with incense, and the rhythmic chanting of priests resonates like a heartbeat, pulsing through the crowd. It's a performance as much as a prayer, where every gesture and word holds symbolic power. The centerpiece is the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual meant to reanimate the senses of the dead, allowing them to eat, see, and speak in the afterlife. Priests use specialized tools, mimicking the opening of jaws and eyes, while reciting spells that blur the line between magic and faith. You watch the lead priest perform the delicate movements with reverence, tapping a ritual adze against the mouth of the coffin. The crowd holds its breath. To outsiders, it might seem like simple theatre, but to the Egyptians, it was a vital step failure meant eternal silence and hunger. Mourning customs vary. 2. Women wail and tear at their clothes, while professional mourners perform dramatic lamentations. The dead are honoured not just with ceremonies but with music, food offerings, and even feasts. Yet even within these solemn gatherings, there's room for humour and human error. One story tells of a priest who accidentally used the wrong incantation, causing the crowd to burst into nervous laughter. It's a reminder that even divine rituals had their off days. Here's a lesser-known fact. Some funerals included a fake burial, where a dummy coffin was buried to fool grave robbers. The real coffin was hidden elsewhere. A clever, if risky, attempt at protection. You also notice the significance of time in these rites. Funerals had to align with a specific lunar and religious calendars, often taking place on auspicious days to maximize spiritual benefit. Historians debate whether these rituals evolved gradually or were formalized early on to solidify social order and religious control. What's clear is that funerals were community events. reinforcing bonds between the living and the dead. As the sun sets, you see the procession winding through desert sands toward the tomb. Torches flicker, shadows dance on sandstone walls, and the air buzzes with chants, tears, and hope. The dead's journey is just beginning, and you're lucky enough to walk alongside, aware that, even in death, life's complexities persist. You find yourself in the eerie silence of the tomb after the funeral procession has left. Yet the story of the mummy doesn't end here. In fact, this is where legends and whispers begin to gather stories of mummies walking, curses awakening, and restless spirits wandering the night. You might expect such tales to be mere myth, but some ancient witnesses claimed otherwise, and historians remain intrigued. Imagine the scene: the tomb sealed tight, flickering torchlight casting shadows on the walls, and the air thick with the scent of resin and incense. Suddenly, faint noises echo a shuffling sound, a low groan. Guards stationed outside the tomb report strange movements inside, shadows shifting unnaturally. Could it be the restless dead, or simply the wind playing tricks? Ancient Egyptian texts rarely mention these walking dead, but some funerary spells hint at the dead's ability to rise, if not properly contained. This gave rise to a cultural fear that if embalming or burial rituals were imperfect, the deceased might return not as a blessing, but a curse. There's an infamous account recorded on a papyrus fragment discovered in the 19th century describing a mummy's curse, where tomb workers fell ill or disappeared after disturbing a burial. Though modern science explains much by natural causes, bacteria, toxic molds, or simply coincidence, the idea captured imaginations worldwide. You hear stories from the desert villagers who swear they've seen bandaged figures wandering near tombs at night. Some believe these mummies are guardians of the dead, cursed to protect sacred places forever. Others think they are spirits trapped between worlds, seeking release. But here's an intriguing detail: not all mummies were expected to stay quiet. Some high-ranking individuals were embalmed with rituals intended to animate them in the afterlife, empowering them to act as protectors or judges. This blurred the line between corpse and guardian. Historians debate whether these tales of walking mummies were allegories for the power of memory and legacy, how the dead walk through stories and influence the living, or literal, beliefs held by some ancient Egyptians. You imagine yourself as a tomb guard, night watch duty in the desert chill, eyes darting to every shadow. The flickering torchlight reveals nothing but your own breath, yet you can't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching. And let's not forget the odd practical problem mummies caused. Some burial chambers shifted over time due to earthquakes or sand, causing mummies to fall or slide. Visitors who stumbled upon them might have thought the dead were moving, not to mention cases where wrapping loosened and bodies shifted positions, possibly fueling supernatural rumours. One embalmer's notebook rediscovered in a rare papyrus jokingly mentions the ghostly dance of a mummy whose wrappings came undone, leading to a chaotic scene in the burial tent. The humour reminds us that ancient Egyptians had a sense of levity, even amidst death. These stories, whether fact, fiction, or something in between, added layers of mystery to the already complex rituals. They shaped how Egyptians viewed death not as an end, but as a continuum filled with potential dangers and powers. As you leave the tomb behind, the night sky blankets the desert, and you carry with you the echoes of footsteps not entirely your own. The dead may rest, but their stories still walk beside you. You step back into the broader context of ancient Egyptian society, where mummification wasn't just a religious ritual, but a cultural expression woven into the fabric of daily life, politics, and identity. Understanding how mummies walked requires looking beyond tombs and rituals and peering into how these practices reflected and influenced the living world. Consider the pharaohs, the god-kings of Egypt, whose mummification was both a spiritual necessity and a political statement. Their bodies weren't just preserved. They were symbols of divine power, meant to transcend death and legitimize rule from beyond the grave. You picture yourself at the grand tomb of Ramses II, surrounded by artisans, priests, and officials all devoted to crafting the perfect eternal vessel. But mummification wasn't exclusive to royalty. Nobles, priests, and even some wealthy commoners took part in this elaborate dance with death. It was a way to assert status and secure a place in the divine order. Your mind drifts to the common folk. Though those who couldn't afford lavish burials, did they walk differently in death? Were their bodies treated with less care, their spirits less assured? You learn that mummies often served as social currency. Families displayed their ancestors' remains during festivals, invoking blessings and communal identity. Ancestor worship was a vibrant part of Egyptian culture, blurring lines between past and present. The walking dead were present in the lives of the living, through rituals and memory. Here's a quirky detail: some mummies were reanimated for festivals taken out of tombs, ritually cleansed, and paraded through the streets to connect with the community. These events were both sacred and festive, reminding everyone that death was intertwined with life. However, there were also practical consequences. Mummies required care even after burial offerings, prayers, and protection from tomb robbers. Families hired priests to perform maintenance rituals, ensuring their ancestors remained comfortable and powerful. Neglect could lead to walking in another sense, restless spirits wandering due to forgotten rites. This ongoing interaction challenges the modern idea of death as a closed chapter. Instead, death in ancient Egypt was a dynamic relationship, a continuous dialogue between worlds. There's also political intrigue in the mix. Royal tombs were targets not just for grave robbers, but for political enemies who sought to erase or manipulate legacies. The desecration or unwalking of a mummy could be a powerful statement erasing a ruler's claim to immortality. Historians debate whether the embalming and burial practices evolved primarily from religious beliefs, or were also shaped by social and political needs. It's likely both. After all, preserving a body was preserving a reputation and power. As you ponder this, you notice how these practices influenced art, literature, and even law. Mummy depictions appear in stories warning about hubris, morality, and divine justice. They became cultural icons, walking metaphors for eternity, judgment, and transformation. Before you leave this chapter, you remember the phrase often repeated by Egyptologists: "The dead do not rest. They walk among us in stories, in rituals, in memory, and in a way." That is the truest form of walking a mummy ever does. You now enter the mysterious realm of mummy curses and the public fascination they sparked, a phenomenon that turned ancient burial practices into legends of horror and superstition, while the Egyptians themselves had complex beliefs about death and protection. Later generations added layers of myth that transformed mummies from sacred ancestors into supernatural entities. Picture the early 20th century, when archaeologists uncovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, a find so spectacular it sent shockwaves around the world. Alongside golden treasures and perfectly preserved mummies came stories of curses, sudden deaths, accidents, and strange illnesses afflicting those involved in the excavation. Newspapers sensationalized these events, feeding the public imagination with tales of vengeful spirits. But were these curses real? Scientific inquiry suggests most of these incidents were coincidences, exacerbated by the psychological power of suggestion. Still, the idea of a mummy's curse had a gripping hold on popular culture, influencing books, movies, and art for decades. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians did inscribe warnings on tombs, but these were primarily intended to deter grave robbers with threats of divine retribution, rather than actual curses. The difference between protective spells and curses is subtle, but important. You recall the curious case of the Curse of the Pharaohs as an academic debate. Some scholars argue it's a modern invention born from colonial anxieties and fascination with the exotic. Others see it as a genuine reflection of ancient beliefs twisted over time. The fear of mummies walking took on new life in Western culture, Images of shambling bandaged figures and terrifying revenants became staples of horror. Yet, in ancient Egypt, the concept was more nuanced, tied to ideas about the soul's journey and the potential dangers of improper burial. Another little-known fact is that some priests deliberately designed protective rituals around walking spirits, aiming to harness their power for the living. In this sense, the walking dead could be guardians or harbingers of justice, rather than malevolent beings. You also discover that mummies had a practical effect on the living artifacts. Relics, and even mummified animals were believed to hold power and were used in medicine and magic. So, the influence of mummies walked beyond the tomb, into the very fabric of everyday life. Historians continue to debate whether the curse stories ultimately helped protect tombs by instilling fear, or simply exploited superstition for profit. Regardless, the legacy of the walking mummy in popular imagination remains powerful. As you leave this chapter, you're struck by how a practice rooted in deep spirituality and respect for the dead transformed into a symbol of terror and mystery. It's a reminder that stories evolve, sometimes walking far from their origins. You arrive now at the final stretch, the enduring legacy of ancient Egyptian mummification and its walking echoes in our modern world. This is where history meets myth, science intersects with legend, and the stories of those wrapped in linen continue to walk through time, influencing culture, art, and even science today. You reflect on how mummies fascinated explorers, scientists and artists alike, from the first European encounters with Egyptian tombs to today's museums housing these relics. The mummy's image evolved a symbol of mystery, mortality, and the quest for immortality. Modern forensic science has peeled back layers of linen and legend, revealing details about ancient health, diseases, and embalming techniques once lost to time. Mummies have been scanned, analysed, and even subjected to DNA testing, offering clues about diets, family ties, and epidemics that shaped ancient societies. But with all this knowledge comes new questions. Some mummies show signs of ailments previously unknown in antiquity. Some reveal embalming practices once thought impossible, and scholars still debate the true purpose and meaning behind many rituals. Did Egyptians see mummification as a way to literally walk into the afterlife? Or was it more symbolic? This question remains open, inviting each generation to interpret. You also notice how the mummy has walked into popular culture, not just as horror, but as a symbol of fascination with death and rebirth. Films, books, and art repeatedly revisit the image, blending historical fact with fiction to captivate audiences worldwide. There's also a surprising environmental angle. Studies of mummy wrappings and embalming substances inform us about ancient trade routes, ecological changes, and human impact on landscapes. Even the humble linen bandage tells a story of cotton fields, weaving techniques, and economics. And here's a fun tidbit: some modern artists use mummy imagery to explore themes of identity, memory, and decay. The walking dead inspire creative expressions that bridge past and present, reminding us that death is both an end and a beginning. As you take a final look at the dusty sarcophagus and feel the cool desert breeze, you realise the true power of these mummies isn't in their preserved flesh, but in the stories they carry, stories that still walk beside us, whispering from the sands of time. Now, as promised at the start, it's time to wind down. Let your mind drift gently from the sands and silence of ancient Egypt. Imagine the warm desert night wrapping you like soft linen, the distant call of night birds soothing your thoughts. Breathe deeply, releasing the day's worries, and feel the calm wash over you. Remember, though these mummies once walked in strange, unsettling ways, now they rest peacefully beneath the timeless dunes, and so shall you, in your own quiet rest. Sleep well,